Okay, so let me just jump into the data for the sake of time and just say a lot of the data collection analyses, or all of it, was really funded by NIH, particularly NICHD, NIMH, and NIMHD. But in particular, all the COVID data that I'll be talking about, or the vast majority of it, was collected because of a supplement of NIMH and more recently the UO1 from NICHD. So the data I'm going to talk about today are from the Future of Families and Child Wellbeing Study. This is primarily funded by NICHD, and it's the longest continuously running national birth cohort study in the United States. It is a probability sample of around 5,000 births from 20 large U.S. cities with an oversample of non-marital births, which, because of that sampling, has a very unique race and SES distribution, I think, that make it particularly interesting for studying COVID and COVID vulnerable populations. We have data from at birth, age 1, 3, 5, 9, 15, and 22. These are the already publicly released core data. And what's a little bit different about this is we have a subsample that is called the Study of Adolescent to Adult Neurodevelopment. It started off at age 15 with just 3 cities in Detroit, Toledo, and Chicago, but then has expanded to more Midwestern cities for the most part, and Nashville at age 21. And if you do the math of kids who were born in 1998 to 2000, when they're 20 to 21, you'll see what the problem was. Is in around January of 2020 is when we started collecting our second round of neuroimaging data. This neuroimaging data, or SAND, has MRI, mental health, adversity variables, genetics, epigenetics, and then, as I mentioned, we started collecting COVID data, and that's from around 1,763 of the young adult and primary caregivers. This is a slightly different view of that study, of this whole study, and you can see all the different time points that we have, and not unlike we were just talking about, we try to use all of the prior characteristics and the trajectories of mental and physical health to kind of adjust for the effects of trying to predict the effects of COVID on later mental and physical health. And in this case, what we're talking about is a COVID era, early COVID era, like 2020, starting in around April 28th, I think, of 2020. We started collecting data online for this subsample around COVID. And then the main core came in at age 22 to 23. And then at age 24, we just finished the SAND COVID follow-up in December of 2024. And we hope to have that released. Everything else has been released up until now, and we hope to release those data later this summer. Okay, so what is our specific research question? It's that our essential work status, and actually other types of work statuses associated with mental health longitudinally or cross-sectionally and longitudinally. In the study population, it's really just focused on that SAND COVID population, the subset of mostly Midwestern cities that we were talking about for both the young adult and the primary caregiver. And we're talking about essential, non-essential, and unemployed. The outcomes that we look at are primarily, for this presentation, just looking at things like perceived stress, depression, and anxiety, because we have slightly different measures at the core versus the COVID studies. We just had to code it as to probability of mild or severe anxiety or depression. So as we've been talking about it, essential workers, depending on which thing you're looking at, you can have slightly different definitions. We had originally started ours using the Economic Policy Institute's definitions, but these are actually pretty similar to what we were just talking about with frontline workers, actually. We've recoded this either using that coding or just a report of whether or not the individual themselves reported being an essential worker. The results stay fairly similar. But just so you have a sense of how prevalent this was in our sample, around 34% of them were essential frontline workers and 51% of the parents were. And the most common jobs that were reported were things like package delivery, grocery or food production, caregiving, and some medical. And so actually to the discussion we were just having, or the talk we were just hearing from, what are some of the effects of this? These are just different things that happen due to being an essential worker. When we were talking to them again in early or mid 2020, the darker bar is the young adult, the lighter bar is the parent. And you start to see that there's a big change in increase in hours, or how often you had to either live away from home or at least minimize your contact with your family. So these are pretty significant changes that happen. And actually, as we just heard, there are fairly large differences between being an essential worker or non-essential worker, less by sex overall, but definitely SES and race had very big differences, very big um, for being an essential worker or being unemployed. Um, so more to that point of what happened here. And we'll look at some of these other measures that we have later on. But one of the things you learn really quickly is that even for essential workers, there was still a significant change in income, or if for these populations, there's a significant change of income or unable to get work for those who did not have work. And especially for young adults, a large percentage of them lost their jobs that they had and then were unable to get work. So it was a pretty tumultuous time for this population during that first year of the pandemic. Um, so I'll just jump into some of the more specific data. And just thinking about, we're going to look at kind of three different groups, and then solid lines will be the young adults, and dotted or hashed lines are going to be the parents. And this is when I say primary caregiver, it sounds a little strange for young adults, but that's really what that's talking about, is who was their primary caregiver. And most of the time that was the mother, biological mother. So here we have different measures in 2020. Again, this is like mid 2020, and then in 2022 and 2025. And for the essential workers, you do see a fairly high rate to begin with of depression, but it increases to 2022 and 2025. One of the things that was really interesting when we looked at this is when you look at the non-essential worker and even unemployed for the young adults, we really didn't see any cross-sectional differences at 2020. So what we were expecting to see is already high rates of depression, but that wasn't happening in the first year of the pandemic. But we do see a pretty big difference 2 years later, and then it kind of is starting to come back in 2025. Remember, though, these are people who are in their early 20s who were just trying to transition into adulthood. When we look at their parents, not unlike the results we just saw, we consistently see no real difference. There's significant differences in level by parent or child, or adult child, but really no difference within that work group or employment category for the parents who are now in their 40s and 50s. Anxiety is a little bit different. For the young adults, we see this kind of interesting situation where it was always high or moderate anxiety for both for anyone who was employed actually during this time period, and stayed fairly constant over this whole time, whereas those who were unemployed actually had a reduction in anxiety, mostly due to the fact that they end up getting jobs by 2 years later. And it's a little bit different for the parents, but we end up seeing not much of a difference actually, even though it looks much larger than it is. Let me talk about perceived stress. It's a slightly different story here. We only have the 2 time points. We didn't get a perceived stress measure in the core study. And again, we're seeing essential workers having this higher level of stress, but that ends up narrowing to some degree, especially with the unemployed. And again, the parents, we see really no significant difference by employment status for those. So again, it's this difference in like the cohort of, it's like a cohort effect of what was happening to this group, in part because of the transition to adulthood occurring during COVID. Um, a slightly different analysis related to income, just loss of income. So regardless of which employment type you had, just a loss of income and depression. And again, we see really big differences by employment category. If you, or whether or not you lost income, that's the solid blue bar versus the other two lines, which is no loss or were unemployed. And again, in this case, we see a smaller difference in 2020. It increases and then it stays a little bit higher for those who do lose income. And that's even accounting for changes in income after the fact. So we were already accounting for prior characteristics, but then accounting for changes in income later. So there was something unique about losing your income in that severe early year of COVID, but no differences among the parents. Yeah, and we see that uh, yeah, a lot of this is about the mental health is really about uh, what they experienced, but then also what they ended up having later on. If they had a job later on, things got much better. Okay, so kind of quickly gone through this, but I think it matches a lot of what we were just hearing, right? Essential workers did experience significant stressors during COVID, and this is what we were kind of anticipating, changes in living arrangements, work hours, and income. Um, but eh, there was little influence of work status on mental health early on in the pandemic, which was really surprising to us too. In the middle term, the influences differed significantly by cohorts. So young adults, we did see a difference and it was very consistent and robust. But their parents, we didn't see much of a difference. And that's particularly true for depression. But we've returned to kind of those 2020 levels, which is interesting for most people by 2024. And it does seem that loss of income has a unique and independent effect on the midterm depression for young adults. And I think that's it. And that's about as long as my voice was going to last. So I'll stop sharing.